Okay, can you all take your seats? We'll be starting in a minute or two. Last chance to grab a cup of tea or coffee. Feel free to come sit a bit closer. Okay, λίγο ησυχία, ξεκινάμε. Good evening, everyone. Kalispera σας. Let us begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. We're almost 2/3 of the way through this year's program. While half of Melbourne is in Greece, winter, and what a winter it's been, is drawing to a close. So thank you everyone for turning out tonight. From now until the end of the year, until early October, all the seminars will be at the mezzanine with the exception of the 31st of August, seminar by John Giannakis, who will be delivering online from Athens. So it's an opportunity to bring back that vibe and social interaction of pre-COVID times. Furthermore, expect to see some special seminars in October and November. We'll give you ample warning. We also have the visit of Professor Giorgos Anagnostou from Ohio State University in October. And don't forget that the program for the October Film Festival has just been released as well online. So book your tickets early, especially for opening night. Next week, next Thursday, in a return to the first years of the series, will be a double header. An initial seminar will begin at 6 p.m, followed by another seminar at 7:15 p.m. The first seminar will be by Professor Michalis Pakogiannis from the Aristotelio Πανεπιστήμιο in Thessaloniki. It will be in Greek and it's titled «Η Ελλάδα, ένα σταυρωμένο κορμί του Γιώργου Σεφέρη, ο εμφύλιος πόλεμος στην ελληνική πεζογραφία». The words, which translates as Greece as a crucified body by the poet Yorgos Seferis, the Greek Civil War in Greek prose. Also allow me to mention that Professor Bakogianni is a visiting scholar at La Trobe University's Greek Studies Department. He'll be here for about a month. The other seminar beginning at 7 p.m. or thereabouts is by a well-known figure, Dean Kalimniou, Pyrrhus, the Western Alexander. You've probably all heard where the term Pyrrhic victory derives from. It's from this general who was based in what's now present-day Epirus. But let's gravitate to tonight's topic, Greek-Australian women and welfare advocacy in the 1970s, to be delivered by Dr. Alexandra Dellios. Melbourne-born Dr. Dellios is a cultural historian and a senior lecturer at the Centre for Heritage and Museum Studies at the Australian National University in Canberra. She was awarded a PhD by the University of Melbourne in 2015. In 2017, Melbourne University Press published the first book, Histories of Controversy, the Bonegilla Migrant Centre, which gave an alternative picture of Bonegilla's history, revealing the centre's history to be one of containment, control, deprivation and political discontent. Basically, Bonegilla's history is one of complexity rather than the tame narrative that's often promoted. She has published works on child migrants, commemoration and heritage, and post-war migration and settlement in Australia. She's currently researching public history practices of community groups with a migrant background and interactions with official definitions of heritage when making their migration stories more public. The talk today is on Greek-Australian women and welfare advocacy in the 1970s. The field of social welfare underwent dramatic changes during the 1970s. Some of these changes were propelled by the demands of migrant and ethnic minority communities. It was also a time when multiculturalism was gaining momentum. These Greek Australian women at the coalface that played a key role, they were in the migrant welfare and advocacy field as in various positions as welfare rights officers, interpreters, welfare workers and activists. It was also a time when numerous ethnic-based welfare organisations were established. This presentation today will explore the experiences of these women through archival work and oral testimonies. Alex, the floor is yours. Big round of applause for our speaker tonight.
Thanks, Nick. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. I'd just like to add my acknowledgements to Nick's, to the Wurundjeri people, and recognise their continuing connection to the land, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So in public hearings for the Commission of Inquiry into Poverty in the early 1970s, members of the Marrickville Liaison Community Service presented testimony. At this time, 13% of the population of Marrickville was Greek-speaking. The then director of the community service spoke about the role played by one staff member in particular, Poppy Nassus, in which he encapsulated a lot of the welfare problems facing migrant communities at that time. He spoke in particular about the poverty of communication. The same questions and problems are being expressed by ethnic minority groups and welfare societies, those that had been filling gaps in service provisions since the post-war immigration boom began. Obviously, the greatest problem in this case, as well as many others, was their reliance on very few bilingual workers to service a large migrant population. The 1970s was a transformative period for the field of social welfare, including both the work emanating from government departments as well as the voluntary and non-for-profit sector. These were both structural and ideological changes. When it came to demands around equity and access in the provision of welfare in Australia, this change was heavily influenced by the demands and the work of migrant and ethnic minority communities. So today I'm exploring the role played by Greek Australians, and especially women, in the migrant welfare and advocacy field. They worked as welfare rights officers, social workers, youth workers, and health and legal interpreters. Greek Australian women worked and volunteered at the front lines of multicultural service delivery, meeting the complex needs of migrant and non-English speaking communities, especially Greek-speaking cohorts. I wanted to understand the work they undertook for their communities in the context of a developing multicultural bureaucracy. So in addition to archival work, this paper draws on oral histories conducted with Greek background welfare workers who are active in Sydney from the 1970s onwards. All of the women were known to each other. Some of them worked closely together. Some of them worked from positions within ethnic community groups, within Greek Orthodox communities, or the Australian Greek Welfare Society in Melbourne, for example, or in ecumenical charities like the Ecumenical Migration Centre in Richmond, or in the state-funded multicultural information and health centres that emerged in the 1980s. Some of them began as volunteers, and volunteer labour played a huge role in meeting the welfare needs of migrant communities, and then went on as the field professionalised to train and take up formal roles as social workers or in a welfare officer capacity. So in part one of this paper, I'm just going to provide a historical timeline, a political, social and economic canvas on which to pin the experiences and the work of the women that I interviewed. And then part two will turn to their testimonies and the issues that they remember most from their careers. So I began this paper by citing from proceedings for the Henderson Inquiry into Poverty in Australia, conducted in the early 1970s. This was an era that saw the so-called rediscovery of poverty, with similar surveys conducted in other English-speaking settler colonial states too. The Henderson Inquiry was the first systematic measure of poverty in Australia. The hearings, transcripts for which are accessible at the State Library of New South Wales, gave community groups and voluntary welfare organisations the opportunity to testify about their problems and to offer their views on solutions. So this process of community consultation reflected the reformist energy of the late 1960s and 1970s, which informed fresh approaches to welfare reform and social policy innovations. It also influenced the approach of staff in the growing third sector, that is government and non-government welfare agencies, some of whom were also schooled in activist and social movement politics, anti-racism, women's lib, civil rights movements. The Henderson Inquiry itself revealed that almost 14% of migrant households from non-English speaking countries had incomes that placed them below the poverty line, and this was double the overall figure for the Australian population. In some measurements, 18.7% of migrants were classified as poor or marginally poor, particularly in inner urban areas of Melbourne. Non-Anglo migrants were also reported as spending more on housing costs due to discrimination in the rental market. In employment, they had higher rates of workplace accidents, partly due to language difficulties and unfamiliarity with safety procedures. There was also a lack of awareness of their rights and entitlements as workers. Migrant groups had higher rates of physical and mental health problems, again, partly because they were unaware of the services that they could access, or because they were not tailored to their needs. So by the 70s, the bulk of Australia's industrial working classes were post-war immigrants from a non-English speaking background. It was also during this time that the migrant or ethnic rights movement emerged, an inter-ethnic social justice movement that sought the support of unions and advocated for structural changes and the positive promotion of a multicultural Australia. Activists within that movement, migrant workers, migrant unionists and left-wing activists and their allies, made demands for better access, representation and participation in all levels of politics and public life. And some of the welfare workers I'll mention were a part of this movement, more so in Melbourne than in Sydney. Zooming out for a moment though to general histories of welfare, according to Stephen Garton's history of the welfare field, by the 1960s there were only 400 university-trained social workers in all of Australia. As a profession, the welfare was a small field in the 1940s to the 1960s. The professional practice of social work, in a narrower sense, was modelled on the British example. It focused on social aspects of poverty, in contrast to the American emphasis on psychology. While the post-World War II period did actually see a growth in government and private sector services, the growth of the profession was small and slow by international standards. New trained welfare workers were taught to see poverty as a consequence of unemployment, illness, family breakdown, and lack of access to services. Their role was to mediate between the needs of the client and available services, to identify people in need, advise them of help available, contact services, and arrange things like employment or home care. And that was a break from the charitable tradition of the 19th and early 20th centuries by churches and charitable organisations that were staffed mostly by middle-class volunteers with a more moralising approach to charity and ideas about the deserving poor. Some traditional practices did linger, as did racialised expectations of who could or couldn't make demands for care and what type of care they deserved. The heavy vetting of the deserving was and is a feature of social security. Social workers, but especially departmental officers, sometimes invasively investigated applicants, and people could be denied assistance based on moral judgments if they were assessed to be, for example, of bad character, with crude assessments as to their cleanliness, whether they were considered slovenly or associated with suspect people. Some of these discourses we can see as consistently operating in government departments and the social security sector more broadly. Of course, this is to say nothing of the patronising paternalism that is reserved for First Nations communities and their ongoing victimisation by settler colonial welfare systems. When it came to post-war migration and new migrant communities, there were very few targeted welfare services available. and particularly for those after the first 2 years of settlement. There were not enough social workers employed by the Department of Immigration. In the 1950s in particular, departmental social workers were dealing with the immediate needs of new arrivals. Community organisations scrambled to fill the gaps in service delivery. Informally too, family and village networks filled these gaps in service provision, as did workers' leagues like the Democritus in Melbourne or the Atlas in Sydney, and the Greek Orthodox communities. When it finally did come along in 1969, the federal government's grant in aid scheme was important, as it directed some of its funding to ethnic community groups to hire trained social workers. But there was still a lot of work to be done. As mentioned, the migrant rights movement started to play a role in effecting change to welfare and service provision for migrant communities from the late 1960s. The network in Melbourne included groups like the Centre for Urban Research and Action in Fitzroy and the Ecumenical Migration Centre in Richmond. They were joined too by migrant background unionists and workers' leagues. In the early 70s, the Ecumenical Migration Centre began to employ more Greek-speaking welfare activists and social workers, which was necessary for them because most of the clients in Richmond were of Greek background. And this includes social workers and welfare activist Lula Rodopoulos, and a few others that I'll mention in a moment. The hiring of female staff in these positions also enabled the Ecumenical Migration Centre to work better with families, especially those headed by solo mothers. They also had frequent contact at this time with the newly established Australian Greek Welfare Society, which was formed in 1972. So this is my attempt to map some of the names that came up in some of the records. At this time as well, a lot of new studies emerged, some of them published through third sector agencies and community action groups, including the EMC, as well as those coming out of the Australian Greek Welfare Society, that really showed the extent of the structural problems facing their communities. The research and their advocacy for policy reform was symptomatic of this new and intense focus on social policy and community development. At the level of federal politics, various Whitlam government initiatives had a significant impact on the very nature of discussions being had by welfare and social workers. I'm thinking of things like the Health Insurance Act of 1973 that established Medicare, or Medibank then, the implementation of Whitlam's Australian Assistance Plan, which actually funded regional councils for social development, so groups that coordinated social welfare services in their region. These new initiatives in social policy were occurring as the outcomes of the Henderson Inquiry into poverty was, as its first reports were coming out. During the years of the Whitlam government, there was a marked increase in the range and volume of government grants given to community bodies, including welfare groups. Many of these grants were funneled through a range of new government programs, most notably the Welfare Rights Officer Scheme, which was administered by different agencies of the government, notably the Department of Social Security and its new Social Welfare Commission. Like the Grant in Aid scheme, the Welfare Rights Officer scheme had some of its funds directed to ethnic groups. Many of the women I interviewed or came across in the archives were hired by ethnic organisations thanks to the allocation of these grants. Some of the debates at the time tried to tackle and change the assumptions and attitudes of mainstream service providers. Mainstream service providers and their expectations that it was simply culture that was the major factor hindering non-English speaking background migrants' use and access to social services, and that this could be overcome after the first generation and with assimilation. Their understanding of those cultures was superficial and monolithic. So this was culturalism based on stereotypes about rural and less educated migrant groups, now part of Australia's industrialised working class, and assumptions about their orientations to things like modern healthcare, the legal system, and social security payments, for example. However, to refer to social researcher Michael Liffman, publishing in the late 70s and early 80s, much of the behaviour of immigrants in a new country is not just due to their culture, but to much more straightforward factor of their failure to understand arrangements, procedures and assumptions in the new country. Liffman's work tracked the broader changes in factors impacting social worker approaches and barriers to developing a truly pluralist welfare system suited to a multi-ethnic Australian population. Lula Rodopoulos, then a social worker in the Ecumenical Migration Centre, explained in the 1970s that that period was defined by a swing to a more pluralist approach to social services. The weaknesses identified in an assimilationist and paternalist approach was giving way to specialist ethnic welfare agencies, although she didn't deny that this also had its problems. At that time, the Australian Greek Welfare Society, through various state grants, also took on more client work with the Greek community in Melbourne, where Nick Pilates was the trained social worker. A lot of their work was also undertaken by the Society's welfare rights officers, Rita Packer and Celeste Dufas. Volunteer labour was also very important, even in meeting complex client needs and for conducting house visits. To return to Rodopoulos' points, though, from the late 1970s, she identified a pattern in which mainstream Anglo-Australian social workers would pass on so-called difficult cases, especially cases where clients may not have English, to appropriate ethnic agencies or grant and aid agencies, who were expected to handle complex health, psychological and social matters, while the mainstream service provider withdrew. She argued that mainstream social workers were unaware of the standard of expertise of the, and I quote, often untrained ethnic personnel who handled the cases. She thought the approach may ignore the responsibility that general services have in meeting resource needs or in better equipping personnel that may be more appropriate than ethnic welfare agencies. Now, these anxieties over qualifications, which was much discussed at the time, as well as the legitimacy of claims to social work expertise, comes up again and again in the testimonies from the people presenting at the Henderson Poverty Inquiry in the early 70s. Some of those people distinguish between bilingual welfare officers or volunteers and general welfare people as less qualified than those social workers with degrees. However, to others working in the field, particularly those with valuable life experiences of migration and ethnicity, these distinctions could be overblown and were not always useful when aiming for a humanising approach, or in a migrant setting with one of the key goals being to understand the context and appropriately convey information, or being able to hear and communicate with people in order to help them connect with the services that they needed and were entitled to. As an example, voices from within the Greek Welfare Society spoke with dismay at the effects of professionalisation on the welfare field. The president, Spiro Moriatis, himself a GP, argued at a migrant studies conference on social welfare planning in October 1975 that some of these professionalised social workers could not adequately relate to their clients. The issue of not being able to relate to one's clients was also something that Rodopoulos explored. On the issue of the emergence of the trained ethnic social worker, she did see inherent problems, including their work within, as she says, an Anglo-Saxon social framework, in which social workers attempt to impose techniques that may conflict with certain cultural outlooks and ways of coping. Instead, she encouraged a framework that is understood and accepted by the ethnic group itself. Although an approach that also silos communities and reifies their cultural outlooks and attitudes as something static rather than something dynamic and changeable would also be inappropriate. Interestingly, she also argued that those with a, and I quote, dual identity, trained by Australians, may have class and professional outlooks that position them at a distance from their migrant background and working class clients, even if they shared an ethnic heritage. I haven't seen this come up yet in other primary sources, but it's definitely something worth exploring from a client perspective. Her point was Again, not to discourage the development of a pluralist approach, but rather to underline the responsibilities of mainstream welfare services to also respond to and understand the perspectives of a multi-ethnic population, to work with communities on their own terms, and to see when complex, longer-term community development approaches, rather than individual casework approaches, might be suitable. There was also a lot of worry emanating from welfare societies, most notably the Australian Greek Welfare Society, over the effect of negative stereotypes of migrant workers claiming disability, which was brought to life in horrific fashion during the Department of Social Security's targeted campaign against the Greek community of Sydney in 1978. What became known as the Greek compensation scandal, or the Greek Social Security scandal, which dragged on through the courts until 1983. So the surveillance and harassment of over 1,000 injured workers, agents and doctors, 200 of whom were arrested and charged with defrauding the Commonwealth by falsely claiming social security benefits, were eventually dropped and compensation paid out to the victims by the late 80s. It was in the wake of the initial arrests in 1978 that the Greek-Australian Welfare Workers Association was formed by welfare workers and activists Vivi Koutsounadis and Angela Manson, whom I'll return to in a moment. In the following years, a Victorian branch of that Welfare Workers Association was also formed. The 1980s also saw many cuts to welfare in general. Under a Hawke ALP government from 1983, the Department of Immigration and Ethnic Affairs realigned the priorities of the grant and aid program that I mentioned earlier, cutting grants to groups like the Australian Greek Welfare Society, COASIT, and the Jewish Welfare Society in favour of short-term programs to newly arrived ethnic groups. At the state level, many multicultural programs came to be administered and provided through state agencies rather than ethnic community groups. The new assumption was that government departments should undertake service delivery for a diverse community rather than filtering aid through funding to smaller ethnic community groups, which seemed like the logical step in developing a system defined by structural pluralism. Some ethnic welfare workers previously employed by ethnic organisations through the grant and aid scheme found employment within state agencies, information and health centres, or the new migrant resource centres that popped up after the Gold-Valley report in 1978. The question was then, should funds be directed to ethnic community organisations to conduct welfare work, or should state agencies be funded to cater to a wider cross-section of the community with appropriate bilingual personnel? For their part, the Australian Greek Welfare Society could see the case for health and welfare programs emanating from one government department, but they also stressed that they should be in close consultation and participation in order to provide services, and I quote, which state and federal instrumentalities may not be capable of performing. They continued to provide many services and argued that they had a special knowledge of the communities that they served. Underfunding remained an issue at both state and federal levels. In a 1982 report, it was noted that while more sophisticated ethnic organisations had increased their demands, they remained under-resourced and under extreme pressure. A crisis in welfare was exposed, not for the first time, in relation to vulnerable ethnic communities, where a concentration of poverty and welfare needs were further compounded by the reversal in the manufacturing sector in the 1980s. So nearly 10 years since the revelations of the Henderson Poverty Inquiry, welfare funding had actually gone backwards in real terms, and poverty levels had worsened, despite the growth industry that was professional welfare work and the explosion of so-called self-help groups that stepped up to fill the gaps in social service delivery. And although Hawke's ALP government was able to avert the dismantling of some tenets of the welfare state begun by Fraser, government welfare programs were not greatly expanded at this time. And familiar demands were still being voiced for more and better trained interpreters, for education on the culture of migrant groups and an encouragement of tolerance and anti-racism, and a reassessment of things like the compensation scheme. And all of this was occurring even as the breadth of ethnic welfare and a more diverse welfare field had developed over the 1970s. So that's part one. I'm turning now to the ethnic welfare workers that I was looking at in Sydney, and the increasing numbers of welfare workers from ethnic minority backgrounds in what had previously been an Anglo-dominated profession. They didn't necessarily come exclusively from second-generation migrants who gained their qualifications in Australia, something that I've heard suggested. Many of them were actually born in Greece and migrated as children, teenagers, and in at least one case as adults. According to the historian Simone Battiston, COASIT was the first ethnic organisation in Australia to employ a qualified social worker through a grant in aid in 1969. FILEF, the Federation for Italian Workers and Their Families, later employed one of their activists as a welfare officer in 1974 through the Welfare Rights Officer Program. One of my interviewees, the welfare worker Freda Economedes, points to this episode when discussing the Greek community of Sydney's first hires in the field. Although I'm thinking the timeline gets a bit confused for me here. She argues that the discussion among herself and others training in the field, particularly Vivi Koutsounadis, was, and I quote, "Well, why don't we get a grant in aid social worker too?" Meaning the Greeks in New South Wales. And according to this account, it was the Archdiocese in Sydney who first applied for a Greek-speaking social worker through the grant and aid scheme. And that went on to become the Greek Welfare Centre in Newtown, which was established as the Welfare and Community Services arm of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese in Australia in 1975, so years later. Freda was employed here, but not until the early 1980s. In 1974, she'd actually been working through the Department of Immigration, where she'd started as a translator but came to take on welfare work. Nonetheless, her colleague and in many ways mentor, Vivi, came to insist that Freda was actually the first Greek social worker, by which they meant professionally appointed Greek-speaking social worker in New South Wales. I should take a step back at this point and explain more about these women and their origin stories. So Freda Economedes migrated from Limnos with her family, including 3 younger siblings, to Sydney in 1954 when she was 10 years old. In her early 20s, she was hired as a bilingual worker in the Good Neighbour Council, where she was employed for 10 years. She says, and I quote, "They employed me in an admin position, but in the end I was doing welfare work." By the time the Good Neighbour Council wound up in 1974, Freda had found work within the Department of Immigration in what was then called the Settlement Department in Sydney. She told me the main problems she saw related to language and people not knowing their rights. It was through the department that she gained some formal qualifications too. They sent her to Melbourne, to Paran College, to do what she calls a migrant welfare certificate, and she remembers doing the course with 2 other Greek-speaking workers from the department, one of them a trained psychologist. In 1975, she chose to leave the workforce when her son was born, but she remembers still getting calls from former clients, those seeking help with their benefits and pensions. She found that she missed the work and didn't like staying at home, so after 8 long years, she applied for the position at the Greek Welfare Centre in Newtown in 1983, where she worked for just 9 months. She then worked as a welfare officer in the State Health Department's Multicultural Health Services, based at the Marrickville Community Health Centre, where she stayed for 35 years until her recent retirement. And it was there that she ran a number of very successful community programs and support groups for Greek-speaking people in the area, which I will return to. Vivi was also a child when she migrated with her family from the island of Chios, the eldest of 3. She was in primary school when she arrived in Sydney, also in 1954. Her mother's brother had arrived during the war and opened up a milk bar in Redfern, which he came to run with his brother-in-law when they arrived. Vivi describes the shop as becoming, and I quote, a sort of welfare agency. The Greeks would go there for help. Like Freda, she also took on a lot of caring responsibilities for her younger siblings. She remembers the poor conditions and workplace injustices her mother faced while working in a biscuit factory, and was made aware of the needs of migrant families in her local community through observing those who came into the milk bar for help. She went on to study psychology. Her MA thesis looked at bilingual language acquisition in child migrants. She recalls applying for a job in her field after she graduated in her mid-20s. She describes encountering an all-male interview panel who then asked her, and I quote, whether her cultural background might interfere with her job. They also asked her whether her parents would allow her to travel to get to and from work. She took great issue with that. She went on to volunteer at the Good Neighbour Council before going on to work at South Sydney Community Aid as a grant in aid migrant advisor. The job consisted of community development work and casework. Like other community aid agencies emerging in the 1970s, the South Sydney Community Aid Centre was fairly radical for its time, advocating for community development, fighting homelessness and poverty, and directly engaging with local migrant communities. Vivi was a tireless advocate, and she went on to help with the setting up of the Ethnic Communities Council of New South Wales. She was a committee member of their Migrant Women's Working Group and was a commissioner for Ethnic Affairs, the Ethnic Affairs Commission of New South Wales. She was also heavily involved in the fight for accessible multilingual childcare for working migrant women, seeing the need for this in Marrickville, and eventually helping to open up a childcare centre at Addison Road Community Centre. And as I mentioned earlier, she, along with Angela Manson, formed the Greek Welfare Workers Association in 1978 in response to the Greek Social Security scandal. She helped with some of the compensation cases for the victims and also presented testimony at the inquiry held in the 80s, speaking to the psychological trauma that it inflicted. In the 2000s, she was president of the Greek Orthodox Community of New South Wales. So welfare worker approaches to family issues in the Greek community were complex. Traditional casework approaches, as I've indicated, in professional social work could prove inadequate here. Garton, in his reflections on the disciplinary approach to welfare, argued that although social work's emphasis on the social environment and psychiatry's stress on individual psychology ran counter to each other, some social welfare experts argued for the virtues of a teamwork approach to deal with multi-problem, that's a quote, families. And women like Vivi and Freda had a dynamic approach to their welfare work with the community, neither adopting one narrow formula and often willing to engage with family units or as part of teams if appropriate. So being part of a network of multilingual and multicultural welfare workers helped in this regard too, as did their knowledge of the needs and cultural expectations of the Greek communities of Sydney and Greek women in particular. In some of the debates from that era, in the 70s, potentially damaging stereotypes about Greek-speaking communities could skew the problems that they faced. That is as something only defined by culture rather than also structural. In the 1970s, some Anglo-Australian medical professionals and academics were publicly arguing that Greeks approached mental illness as a matter of honour and shame and the results of possession by the devil, though they also recognised that the insular and isolated elements of some language groups also resulted in a distrust of hospitals and social workers. Those in welfare societies and ethnic communities obviously objected to some of these cruder classifications, although Rhodopoulos conceded in response to some of these stereotypes that they, and I quote, may be helpful in understanding an extreme situation which reflects a truly traditional rural background. and obviously in recognition of the fact that a large percentage of post-war Greeks in Melbourne in particular hailed from rural areas in the north and were still engaging with mainstream medicine, and were occasionally informed by some superstitions and folkloric remedies, but I stress they still sought medicine and medical services. Dr. Freda Moradis, in response, argued in the Greek language press that Greeks these days see mental illness as something requiring treatment and not as a result of possession by the devil, and that an investment in better services for migrants was what was needed. Obviously, the stereotypes were not in a small way informed by some prejudice in the case of medical professionals. Broader structural and societal barriers to care can compound vulnerable people's isolation from mainstream health services and mental health care. A community analysis project undertaken in 1975, and this is in the west of Sydney, revealed that problems with access to care was partly the result of cultural differences that hindered communication with people like chemists and doctors, but they spoke specifically of the need for interpreters, that this poor communication could come down to the apathy, dismissal, mutual distrusts, and sometimes outright bigotry of service providers. It was also matched with Greek migrants' different expectations of their interactions with medical professionals, as well as simply not knowing their entitlements under the healthcare system. These problems required complex responses and a degree of cultural competence on the part of social service providers and welfare workers, which is where people like Freda come in. These ethnic welfare workers were at the front lines and therefore in a better position to comment on these needs. Freda's experiences are interesting here. She was able to see the value of forming meeting groups or support groups. She ran several groups, including women's groups, men's groups, disability support groups, including for victims of the Social Security scandal, senior citizens groups, exercise groups. Some of them are ongoing and long-term, running, as she says, for a 35-year time span. That is during her time at the Marrickville Community Centre. Others revolved around specific programs and were intended to convey information about a system that didn't always have adequate translation, like health information sessions, for example, around testing for bowel cancer, or information about social security entitlements. Most of them were run in Marrickville and Newtown. The groups were one method in her welfare and community development work with migrant background groups. Freda was not a researcher, but the insights she gained from these groups informed her approach as to how to connect people to the right services, how to tackle people's complex social needs in a sensitive manner. The groups are also important in and of themselves for the social and emotional needs of both Greek-speaking men and women, particularly for some Greek-speaking women whose social worlds were more strictly controlled, or who rarely went out without members of their family or spouses. In this case, the meeting groups are especially valuable, alleviating social isolation, but also creating a safe space for some Greek-speaking migrant women to discuss common concerns around work, health and family, as they were for men, whom Freda says came regularly to her men's group held in Newtown Neighbourhood Centre for well over 12 years. She still runs a women's group. They're playing bingo there, even though she's retired, as well as a multicultural exercise class, which she started 25 years ago at Marrickville Library. I put up a quote here from Angela Manson in the interview that we did together about one of Freda's women's groups. And I should just explain a bit more about Angela, who I've been mentioning throughout this talk. Angela was born in Athens in 1949. She was actually tertiary educated in Greece and migrated to Sydney with her Scottish-born husband in 1975, so much later than Vivi or Freda. She first worked as a welfare rights officer, that government scheme I mentioned, for the Greek Orthodox community of Sydney from 1977 to 79. And then in various welfare and management positions in health services and multicultural services in New South Wales. including as Freda's boss at Marrickville Information Centre, where she initially started as a grant and aid social worker. She went on to become the coordinator for the Healthcare Interpreter Service and the Director of Multicultural Health Services for Central Sydney, Sydney Southwest and Sydney Local Health District. She's referred to the complex problems she encountered among migrant women from the 1970s onwards, citing a lack of resources, support and funding allocated to ethnic welfare, and especially women's social and health needs. Her career trajectory, that is moving from being employed by an ethnic community group to being employed by state services, reflects that change in multicultural service delivery that I mentioned earlier. That is to employ welfare officers earmarked to work specifically on migrant services within existing mainstream community agencies rather than within ethnic community organisations. Yes. All interviewees, but especially Angela, had harrowing stories about the more complex and time-consuming cases they saw over the span of their careers, those involving domestic abuse situations and complex family counselling cases, which could see them engaging with some people and families for decades. I note here that social workers are obviously trained to spot signs of domestic abuse and that an atmosphere of silence around the issue is by no means confined to ethnic minority communities, but it is compounded by other forms of socioeconomic vulnerability and isolation from social structures. And that is, social workers saw family problems as compounded by the isolation of some parts of the Greek-speaking community, particularly women, at this time, and the continuing influence of some beliefs about marriage, privacy and women's roles could hinder her ability to help as a social worker, but also the ability for these problems to be identified by others in the community and spoken about. I don't want to go into personal details here or draw out individual cases because I don't feel like I have the permission to do that from a client perspective. Another thing that Angela stressed, which was also a topic that came up again and again in other interviews, as well as in the research papers and demands emanating from ethnic welfare societies, was the issue of interpreters, particularly for complex social, health and legal issues. Angela says that before the introduction of the Health Interpreter Service in 1977, she would, and I quote, have to go with clients from the Greek community to see specialists and interpret for them, and also psychiatrists and stuff like that. And it was clearly just a big gap. For the Greek community, I was the only welfare rights officer at that time, and I was running like a mad thing. She describes the Health Interpreter Service as a big saviour for many people, and she spoke at length about the importance of health interpreters across different bodies and the importance of proper training in different interpreter programs, that is, as specific programs for those who work in legal aid or health. Obviously, the lack of Greek-speaking welfare workers, legal advisors, teachers, psychologists and psychiatrists was a tremendous problem identified by all ethnic welfare agencies across this period, which in turn could impact things like mental health care, family counselling, family violence cases. And Moradis in particular was concerned with the availability of multilingual psychiatrists, at one point arguing that there was no Greek-speaking psychiatrists in Melbourne, nor any trained interpreters in any mental hospital in the early 1970s. So the accessibility of translation and interpreters in all systems was an ongoing issue. And in many ways, it's the issue that I started with, that quote about Poppy Nassus and her work at Marrickville. It's still an issue in Marrickville today with a very large elderly Greek-speaking population, and many of the original Greek-speaking psychologists and social workers retiring or having recently retired. So I'll finish up here. There is a tension I've alluded to throughout about whether mainstreaming migrant needs into existing systems should be the aim, or whether that is assimilation, or whether that is paternalistic, or is mainstreaming ultimately a stealth way of enabling structural pluralism, a desired outcome that would aid access and equity. How do we measure other things like attitudinal change? What about the value of communities serving communities and the impact of funding to community groups for ongoing programs? I don't have answers here because I'm just a historian, but I am exploring a lot of different perspectives from these oral histories. Greek Australian women working in the welfare field did not stick to any one formula for welfare work, regardless of whether they were trained in Australia or overseas. They placed importance on long-term community development rather than short-term and one-off programs, although these can also have a place. Needless to say, their cultural sensitivities, gained not just through their qualifications but through life experience, enabled them to help their communities and ultimately work to challenge Anglophone systems. Contrary to some debates I outlined at the beginning of this talk, for those who were professionals, they did not see this training as distancing them from their communities and clients, but equipped them with skills to match their cultural capital. They saw the value of social action programs and community-run group work, as well as casework. I'll leave it there. I did just want to put up a quote from Violet Romeliotis, who's the CEO of Settlement Services International, and her outlook and approach to welfare encapsulates some of the changes in practice. She, at a different point in the interview, argues that each new wave of migrant arrivals reaps the benefits of the infrastructure that was set up in the 70s, the expertise and specialisations that developed then, arguing that we're able to tailor our needs now, and that prior to the 70s we didn't have that. And her point, in theory, is that Australia has adaptable mainstream services for multi-ethnic and multilingual arrivals, and that is due to the decades of welfare advocacy and work that began in the 70s. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex, for the presentation. I'm sure there'll be quite a few questions from the audience. Anyone want to kick? Oh, okay.
Hi, Alexandra. Very interesting. Thanks for that lovely talk. I sort of grew up in the 70s, you know, being a child of the 50s. And I'm just sort of interested in whether all of this energy that was put into trying to establish welfare centres and groups, etc., was there the same sort of energy put into trying to educate the migrants that were coming here to try and get them to assimilate to the Australian way of life and the language, to sort of eliminate that language barrier, which seems to be a problem across the board?
Yeah, I didn't really get into the education advocacy part of a lot of these activist networks. I suppose it was more obvious in some of the research that I came across in Melbourne. The Australian Greek Welfare Society had a very active kind of wing that advocated on behalf of the education of migrant children and different kind of methods that were needed, and an investment in migrant education was a big part of their activism and advocacy. And it was about enabling Greek-speaking communities, to better access those services, right? But to also better integrate and thrive within an Australian society. So education was a big part of it. I suppose I was just kind of focusing on social worker discourses, particularly within health, was the angle of a lot of these women based in Sydney and a lot of the work that they kind of did. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Can I also just add something that sort of people forget? Sort of to learn another language, it helps if you already know one. And most Greek migrants that came here, they barely had a primary school education. So it's not like they really were well versed in Greek to be able to make a comparison in learning another language as well. I think that's sometimes underestimated. And so, Mr. Marcos, I think you had a question there at the backs.
Excellent lecture, Alex. And you mentioned Spiro Moradis on numerous occasions. You made no mention of Margaret Moradis, his wife. Now, she had a background in welfare studies. I know she was president chair of Pronya back then, AGWS, in the 80s and 90s. Was she involved in any capacity during the 70s?
Do you know what? I would love to know that, but in the records that I've looked at... Sorry? Well, I'd love to hear, because I mean, I've looked at a lot of the Greek Welfare Society papers from the 70s, all their newsletters and some of the internal memos and meeting minutes. I mean, she's in there, but not very often, particularly in the 70s. I haven't gone much into the late 80s and the 90s, but I'd love to hear more about her work. Like, their papers are donated to the National Library, and it is both Margaret and Spiro. But perhaps she becomes more active in the 80s.
If I can just give you a little bit of history of Greek welfare. Greek welfare started as a committee of the Greek Professionalisation. I founded the Teaching of Modern Greek when I did a feasibility study in the late 60s. And then in 1970, one of my classical Greek lecturers approached me because he wanted to pursue it, and we then launched a major committee, appeal. During that year, he asked me to form a Greek Professionals Association, as he saw that as an important force in the fundraising. When the funds were raised in 1972, there was a group that I call the Triumvirate, which consisted of Spiro Moradis, George Papadopoulos and me. And we stayed on as the committee and invited other members of the Greek community to look into other issues that were relevant to the Greek community. And we identified welfare as priority, the elderly, drug addiction and the youth. We founded Greek welfare on the 15th of August 1972. I was the only woman on the committee, and I served as treasurer for 10 years.
What's your name, sorry?
Eugenia Matrakis.
Yes, okay. I have come across your name. Yes.
You have? Yeah.
Yes.
And I served as chairman for a couple of years.
And you were the only woman on the committee for a very long time.
And I was the only woman for at least 10 years.
Yep.
And I was also the only lawyer, and I was the pro bono lawyer, and I incorporated welfare at the time before there were any computers. Can you imagine that a not-for-profit, a company limited by guarantee, 40, 50 pages, any requisition from the Attorney General, retype it. And that was pro bono. I think welfare, if you can correct me, they reviewed their constitution about 20 years ago. They're having another review now. They paid about 80 to 100,000. As a pro bono, it wasn't just a titular appointment. I was an active pro bono solicitor, and I acted pro bono for Greek welfare for all their purchases of buildings in Richmond and in Brunswick.
Yeah.
I also did all their legal submissions, and I did the submission to no-fault motor car accidents, and also submission into the Dawson Inquiry on property conveyancing, because I personally was concerned that the Greeks were, as a solicitor, I was seeing a lot of clients who were being abused even by their own Greek agents in persuading them into buying property, particularly in country areas where you couldn't build. And I lobbied for there to be disclosure. And all those two submissions that I founded eventually became law. They were legislated. And it sort of, I think, women did not come into welfare, into the Committee of Greek Welfare until well into the 80s. Okay. Margaret at the time was the minute secretary. I was the honorary secretary. Hope that helps.
Yes. To be honest, and this sounds terrible, for the 70s, particularly the early 70s, the only time I came across Margaret's name is when Spiro had scribbled on the back that she'd typed up the minutes. Yes, so, exactly. Yeah.
She did serve on the committee in the 80s and later.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Alexandra, hi. Thank you for that comprehensive overview and description of the way service models developed and provided services to that first generation in particular, who were recipients of service, but they were also largely guinea pigged in many ways. And that will say my parents' generation, etc. But that was a comment, and my question is, in your research, have you had an opportunity to perhaps explore the role of government? And a lot of models of service delivery are designed and offered as a result of government policy and government direction and where they want to go with things. Given that there was a big cohort of Southern European newly established migrants, i.e. the Greeks and the Italians, at that era, the government wanted to do something with them, and hence was started funding, you know, the it was the Ethnic Affairs Commission then that George Papadopoulos headed,
Yep.
and then the Grant in Aid program, etc., etc.
Yep.
So have you had an opportunity to look at what role the government plays in offering and also obstacles that might get presented?
I mean, it is a big part of it. At the moment, my framework is trying to understand how grassroots groups compelled responses from government, noting in particular that era of the Whitlam government was especially active and a key turning point in actually consulting with migrant groups as to their needs, kind of beginning with Al Grasby's migrant task forces after 1973. And as you said, the Grant and Aid scheme was incredibly important for that first generation of ethnic welfare workers. But also then it gets a bit more complicated throughout the 80s when it comes down to looking at how that funding was filtered through state government agencies. And then again, what happens in the 90s when some of those firms are privatised or become consultancies, and the results and effects of that relationship between ethnic communities and government. Yes, it is a huge, it's a huge ask, and it's a huge field. It's something I'm still exploring, yeah.
Just as a follow-up question, I still maintain, I'm a qualified social worker, I've practiced clinically and otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
I still maintain that we're all living and working within a monocultural regime, if you like.
Yeah.
And to some extent we're the product of it, but we're also, impacted by it.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had an opportunity to look at how the system and the models that were presented then may be evolving and changing today?
Yeah. I mean, I'm very much stuck in the 70s, but from what I read about current systems and how consistent the issues that come up again and again in every generation makes me think that as you say, it's still a monocultural system. We're not creating a pluralist social welfare system that caters to a multi-ethnic population. The aim that, many of these activists outlined in the 70s is still, this is opinion, has still not been realised. That's what I sense. But I need to interview more social workers, such as yourself, to get a sense of that.
Do we have any further questions for Alex? Elia.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was very informative and raises a lot of questions as well as answering some. I suppose it's more of a comment than question that all those problems that you were talking about from the migrant problems that the first people who organized welfare groups had to contend with didn't just come up, they were fermenting for years.
Yes.
And really the change of government and the Whitlam government was one of the reasons who brought them to the fore. But they were there beforehand, like the Greek Welfare Society didn't form after the Whitlam, it formed before the Whitlam government. So it was really there fermenting, and you could see it, you can feel it.
Yeah.
And if you were involved in at the time.
Yeah.
I suppose my surprise is also that all the knowledge that we have about all those problems, and we had a pandemic for the last 2 years, and exactly the same problems for new communities came up. So therefore the system just did not learn anything from our experiences in the 70s and 80s, etc. And it's really sad.
Yeah,
So.
I agree with you. I mean, I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from going back to this period and looking at some of those debates. And as I said, it's just, it is quite depressing reading through some of the demands that these migrant rights activist groups are making in the 70s and realising that a lot of the same issues are very much present for other kind of racialised ethnic minority communities today, and that the structures and systems haven't contrary to Violet's perhaps more optimistic outlook on some of those welfare systems, haven't really catered to a multi-ethnic population. Or what we think of as multiculturalism is basically kind of socially and politically bankrupt. But again, that's my opinion. So.
Okay, we have any further questions? I was going to, Crystal?
Thanks very much. You mentioned the interpreter translator training. The first course to be established, it was at RMIT in 1975.
Okay. I did. Yes, it was. Yes, the interpreter program. Yes, and that comes up in the minutes of the Australian Greek Welfare Society as well, as do you. Yes. Thank you.
Excuse me. Did you have a question?
Hi, Dr. Dellios. Thank you very much for your presentation. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to, what really resonated with me, and I'm a trained psychologist, was the comments that you made about, particularly when some of the social welfare workers talked about the really complex cases coming straight back to those particular organisations that were servicing those particular communities. That still happens now.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think that's the reality here, is that things are cycling back and forth, and we do need to do a lot more clearly within the system to be able to sort of, I guess, build capacity in terms of workforce, look at capacity in terms of academia, look at capacity on all sorts of sort of different levels. But I guess they're my comments and my observations, but I'm really quite interested to hear part two for you. I'd like to sort of hear whether you have an interest in actually looking at Victoria and pursuing a lot more of the work that's been done here. There are quite a number of people that have, Chris, Eugenia, quite a number of people in this audience that have actually are part of the history of obviously lots of these sorts of developments. So I'm actually keen to see whether you have an interest to pursue in that sort of area.
I 100% would love to do that. So the reason I began with Sydney is because of a fellowship I got at the State Library of New South Wales, and part of that was conducting interviews for their, what are they calling it, a Greek Australian archive, which is an oral history collection that will be housed at the State Library of New South Wales. And I was like, well, are you going into the 70s? Maybe you need more women in there. And these women worked at the front lines of social service delivery. So that was a context for doing this work and why I started in Sydney. And I would 100% love to expand that into Melbourne and do more interviews here. So yes, please come talk to me. And yeah, for me to get a sense of who was out there and who was working, this is really rudimentary, kind of my attempt to map some of this stuff. I would love to extend it into Victoria as well.
Alex, I might actually ask a question of Christos Fifi, who's also studied this period. Some of those early trailblazers, like George Papadopoulos, Margaret Moradis, I think were on the board of the Greek community, but the board wasn't totally in support of initiative getting involved with this. It was not that they didn't believe there was a need, but they probably thought it was outside their brief. Would you like to say something about that period, Christo? And
I think that the Greek Welfare Society played a major role in Melbourne at that time. It was through the Greek Welfare Society's submissions that the interpreters course started at MIT at that time. And then after a couple of years, in 1977, I think, it was established in Adelaide, another similar course. It was a very important period in the 1970s. We might think of the Galbali report and the SBS and all of those things in that period.
The amount of submissions as well that the Australian Greek Welfare Society produced and submitted to government, it just seemed like they were endlessly churning out papers and making submissions. We were really at the forefront of that kind of activism, from what I can tell, in Melbourne in the 70s. And I'd love to do more work around the other parts of their activism as well. Yeah.